Good evening. My name is Erich Schoeman. Welcome to Matters of the Soul. I am a clinical psychologist and I run the non-profit organization and ministry Matters of the Soul. We have a trust that Matters of the Soul Trust, or in Afrikaans Sake van die Siel Trust, and we do all kinds of upliftment work. And the idea is to minister, especially over the media, to people who are struggling with mental health problems or want to grow as in their personal development, or is just on the lookout for interesting information on psychology. And I also offer some a Christian point of view and a biblical counseling point of view, as I'm a Christian and a clinical psychologist. So the idea is to integrate those two and keep the biblical point of view. So tonight we're looking at OCD, Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. It is indeed very interesting, and so what I'm busy with is I'm going to do a series on OCD. I realize there's just no way I'm going to be able to complete this in 1 hour. So what I'm going to do tonight is just offer you an introduction on OCD and see if you can let's just have a look at the clinical aspects, especially of it. So there's a clear understanding of OCD, the difference between OCD and OCDP, or obsessive compulsive personality disorder, or obsessive compulsive disorder with personality. So it's an understanding what OCD is and whether you have some traits of OCD. So not all of the people watching tonight experience severe debilitating OCD, but most of us have OCD symptoms or even OCD personality symptoms and traits that we can deal with. Okay, so what I'm going to start with is there's a quote from Viktor Frankl that says, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." Okay, so there's a space between stimulus and response, and in there is a space that where we can find freedom. You know, obsessive compulsive disorder, something personal. I don't have the full OCD spectrum and the whole disorder, but I do have some traits, and I've struggled with some of those traits, and I'll be sharing some of it tonight as well. So I find that it is helpful if a therapist shares some of his own struggles as well. I'm not perfect. I'm indeed um, still growing and learning. Okay, so my the idea with life is not easy. Life throws us with all kinds of troubles and problems, and especially a lot of stress. So the last time, a year and a half, or those the world's been struggling with COVID-19, and it's been tough. It's been hard on all of us. So we experience financial pressures and all kinds of things, and those things play a role in stressing us. And you know, some of us deal with our stressors by trying to do stuff uh, where we try to fix this worry and this anxiety that we feel, whether it is or even a fear. So what we do is we try and fix that fear by doing certain things that make us feel better, especially in the short term. Now, some of us distract ourselves in a way that is healthy, and some of us do different things. And OCD people, when they struggle with OCD, it is summed up as the following. You get you will find that there are obsessions and compulsions. So an obsession is when there is usually um, something that is fear-based, something that they are obsessed about, that especially, let's say, for example, they are obsessed about mm, not making mistakes or not being infected by germs. Now, all of that is fear-based, and what then happens is they get intrusive thoughts or unwanted intrusive thoughts, and those thoughts bother them so much and it creates so much anxiety that they then have a compulsion. That is, they do something to quickly fix that anxiety or make it better. Now, whether it is to check whether the stove was turned off, that's the checking and rechecking, or whether it is to mentally go and neutralize that thought through doing a little ritual or a physical ritual, as in counting to a certain number or stepping 3 times forward and 2 times back, whatever. Now, you've seen these humorous things on TV with shows joking about people with OCD, but then also showing that they're not as foolish, they are actually intelligent. And some of these things might look really silly, and even to a person with OCD, they also look silly, but they are caught in the pattern of this fear. So this fear and these obsessions create all kinds of intrusive thoughts, so thoughts that enter their mind that they don't want, that actually disturbs them and upsets them, and then they try to fix that immediately. And then when they do fix that or try to fix it, it actually strengthens the obsession. It tells the obsession, yes, you are really a threat, you are really bad, so you have to do this compulsion, otherwise this threat will become worse. But then, so the obsession becomes worse because the obsession is confirmed, and therefore the next time when the intrusive thought comes in, more anxiety comes with it, and then the compulsion to do something about it, to follow a certain ritual or um, gain a certain feeling, comes in, and then they become stuck in this whirlpool that just sucks them in. So, and it becomes a really scary experience, because you've got intrusive thoughts are not wanted. They are not, they feel like, or the experience is of something that is not controllable, that is outside my control. And I've heard some of my clients tell me, but they realize this is unrealistic or irrational, but the experience is so intrusive, so upsetting, that the fear dictates what is happening. So, all of us have some intrusive or unwanted thoughts at times. Um, and some of those things pop into your mind, and then you think, geez, what's wrong with me? Or why do I have this? But some of us just shrug it off. So we don't become consumed by it and stuck in it in what we call a ruminating pattern, where it is a compulsive behavior where we just feel like we have to do this in order to let that anxiety subside. But in fact, that does not really deal with the actual fear, and it doesn't, and it just, all that it does is it actually just strengthens that fear. So it becomes a vicious cycle, and it gets babies. Sometimes it moves from one area to another. I've seen with my clients, if we they it's as if the OCD jumps from various areas in their life, but what we're actually doing is we're dealing with a pattern of thinking and a pattern of behavior, in how they are approaching their own feelings and their own fears and uncertainties. I am going to offer a biblical Christian psychology perspective at the end of this program. Hopefully, I'm going to briefly give a summary, but I'll devote a whole program to that, because I feel it's really important to give thorough time for that from that perspective as well, because there's just so much to say. My OCD program in Afrikaans is by far the most watched program on matters of the soul. So that's why I've also decided to do a series on this. Okay, so first of all, I've now looked at a non-clinical the description of what OCD is. So, we all go through various kinds of obsessions and compulsions, but we have basically a few types of categories that people struggle with. So you get people that struggle with contamination. They're afraid of contamination, so they wash their hands. This is something that's typical and that you find. And I think what might have happened the last year, since people are, just sanitizing their hands at every single shop. I mean, my hands have never been so clean. It is, I think we might see more of this. Um, Go and try tomorrow, and when they want to say when they want to sanitize you, um, if they've sanitized you, try to touch something and not sanitize yourself, and touch a lot of things and see how you feel. We might have conditioned people to be extremely sensitive for contamination of germs and viruses. But in a sense, that's also good. But when it becomes too much, that's where the problem comes in. So checking, another thing is where you repeatedly check things. Example is the stove turned off, the door locked? South Africa, I think it's rather normal to check whether the door is locked. But it's when you do that despite the evidence, the clear evidence that it is locked, you still feel the compulsion because the anxiety just comes up, because the obsession says, I have to be certain. If I don't have certainty, something bad will happen. And then the intrusive thought says, how do you know it is closed? If you're not going to close it, you're going to be, something bad will happen. And then I'll go into the cognitive therapy analysis of what actually happens in your mind. And then you check it just to feel better, because the anxiety shoots up and you feel anxious. And then you check it, and as soon as you check it, you feel relief. But then sometimes it comes 3, 4, 5, 6 times, and you have to recheck until you feel this sense of relief. So you get stuck in your own feelings. So, okay, those are the checkers. They want to, it's associated with harm or danger. And then the people who doubt and who are afraid, they call it religiously based OCD, where there's this huge fear of condemnation, and they doubt that they have not done things perfectly and they're not right and they've just sinned and this will happen, and if that doesn't happen, then they get punished. So they would go into this huge fear of judgment. It sounds irrational, and when you've given them a biblical base, we'll look at those things as well. What's the treatment for that? And you get people who go into counting and arranging, who's obsessed with order and symmetry, and they might even have some superstitions about numbers and arrangements, or it's just that it looks right this way or doesn't. So we all joke about those things. We say, "Nah, I'm not a perfectionist. I'm not OCD. I don't order things." But then you get all kinds of other kinds of OCD. You do get some hoarding with OCD, while people with OCD tend to hoard, but it's more of a compulsive hoarding. It's not to just bring comfort to themselves. It's usually just to get that intrusive thought away and the anxiety that it brings. It's people who are hoarders or hoarding problems. The hoarding disorder, they do that for comfort, and it's a sense of control. So what we see with OCD as well is that OCD, the obsessive compulsive component, when you look at the cognitive therapy it's very interesting that you have a lot of areas of the thoughts and thinking that is actually involved here. So we've looked at harm, checking those things, but you also have other things where people have, for instance, they struggle with what we call overimportance of thoughts, and these are the cognitive areas. They deem their thoughts as too important, and they actually place too much of an emphasis on how important this thought is, that if I think something, it is almost like this has a huge effect on me and on my life. So they overestimate the importance. It's as if they think their thoughts control the world. So some of these new age tendencies, like The Secret and those things, can also amplify your belief that your thoughts are so incredibly important. And one needs a biblical view of that as well, because it's not necessarily just so important, but there is an importance, and I'll address that later on, where it comes to your thoughts and what the Bible really says about it, because I think some teachings have also taken it too far. But CBT is there, cognitive behavioral therapy, and it addresses your thoughts, but I'll integrate those things later. And then there's that overestimation of danger. They overestimate the danger of forgetting to lock the door. Now, okay, in South Africa, like I said, it's not so unrealistic, but I don't know about in Switzerland, if you even have locks on your doors. In any case, and then there's the crucial one, the desire for certainty. They just want certainty in life, certainty that things are going to work out well, And if I don't have certainty, I retract into a fear-based response. So I go into and I look for certainty. I feel the doorknob again, or I check with this person. Do you love me? Or I've seen it in relationships. How do I know this relationship will work out? How do I know it's going to be fine? So there's this fear of the unknown, and I need certainty. And all those things obviously have a dilemma, because you can't get 100% certainty. You can't even get a lot of certainty. Um, but the Christian view offers certainty, but realistically, you don't have a lot of certainty in life. So that's where faith comes in. But that also doesn't offer a guarantee that everything in life will be perfect and nothing will ever go wrong. So there's a balance that needs to come, and we'll look at that later. Then there's an over estimated sense of responsibility that if you've now um, done something, you've forgotten to put out the garbage, now your house is going to rot, your children will die. It sounds crazy, this, but crazy meaning it sounds far-fetched, but it is. That's the thought pattern. The intrusive thought can really grow into quite a magnificently uh, dark thought, that you actually overestimate or you feel overly responsible for how you treat people, or your effect on people, of what you've said, or small things that you've done. So you feel guilty. And then perfectionism, wanting to do things at a very unrealistically high standard, just creates a lot of problems, because you're trying to find this standard. And if you do not achieve it, then you feel incredible anxiety. So those are some of the obsessions, that if you are obsessed with finding the perfect things, then what happens is you don't. And then the fear comes in, the intrusive thought that reminds you, but you haven't done this, or how do you know? And then you have to compulsively recheck, or do something, or go over it again to make sure it is perfect. Or consequences of anxiety, that you're so afraid, if you feel anxious, that you feel that you might die, or you might lose control, or you might lose your mind if you feel anxious, or a panic attack, that you're going to do stuff that's really wacky. Or you even have fear of positive experiences, of feeling incredibly loved, or being applauded and praised in front of people, and so you avoid those. And then there's what we look at, your core desires and beliefs. So those things are also in there. So there's lots to say, but let's have a look at some of the common obsessive thoughts. So now, as a psychologist, as a human being, and as a Christian, I've experienced many of these things from time to time, in a lesser or a more degree. So, meaning that it is normal to experience some intrusive and obsessive thoughts, and you might have had all of these, but when it is OCD, it becomes so intrusive and so harming, in a sense that it affects your daily living. It affects, and it really makes living on a daily basis hard and difficult, and it affects your work, your relationships, your coping, your integration with people, how it affects the speed at which you do things. And I had a client who would struggle for 2 hours to put on his socks. So it could really affect you in a way that becomes very debilitating. So you get those, like I said, those fears of being contaminated, or fear of losing control, or like jumping up in church and screaming obscenities, or losing your mind when you go onto the airplane because of fear of flying, or fear of becoming psychotic, or you have these explicit, intrusive, violent sexual thoughts or images, or just violent thoughts of stabbing somebody. And it's upsetting to you because you don't want to do it. And for Christians, it's especially upsetting because now they highlight this moral standard, and now you can't think these things. It is sinful, and then they go into a whole guilt cycle. Or you're excessively focused on religious things. You become hyper religious. Now, I'm not comparing that to becoming passionate for the Lord and serving Him. I'm talking about becoming hyper religious. You get lots of rules that you add to Christianity. You cannot drink alcohol. You can't eat pork meat. You can't do this. You can't do that. Things that are not necessarily clearly stated, or that is debatable, and it's not essential for salvation. And you become excessively focused on those ideas. But in a religious sense here as well, in a Christian sense, it would become obsessed with your sinfulness or obsessed with repenting and confessing your sins, so much so that it can take over your thought life. Somebody, and it's, or you can fear uh, losing control, like I said, or that order and symmetry where you must just have things all right. Or you have compulsions, like they said, the checking or tapping or repeating certain words. I've had clients who would now go into doing a little ritual or having to turn their body in a certain way to change the feeling inside, or excessively checking, or praying excessively, like going into saying this prayer over and over, um, or just ordering things. Or I had a client who would wash the kitchen table 9 times, or accumulating lots of junk, not throwing away things that is, like even food, um, like hoarding food and stuff, the fear of contaminating others, or it becomes excessive. Okay, so there are lots of interesting ideas, and it becomes very difficult to deal with. So what happens with is OCD especially is the way you try to get rid of that anxiety and that unwanted thought. That's where the crux comes in. So instead of going to a compulsion, we're going to have a look at how else you can deal with it, and especially in a Christian way, how can you deal with that? So you've now heard what OCD is. It needs to be distinguished from a few other disorders that are related to it, like hoarding disorder, I've mentioned that, or body dysmorphic disorder, where you have certain perceptions on your body that is problematic for you, or also disorders that can be easily confused, like tic disorders, where you do certain behaviors that is similar, but it is not necessarily the same as when you find with OCD, where that OCD comes with intrusive thoughts. And impulse control disorders, where you impulsively do things to get to feel better and to shop and to or to do other impulsive things, sexual things, to just have a sense of relief. Whereas with OCD, there is some impulsivity, and you have difficulty controlling that impulse, but it's not necessarily for the same reason. Or then obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Now I'm going to give you a little bit more information on that. It is a bit different from OCD. Where it is similar is that people with OCPD are people who also make excessive lists. They also become very rigid. They also obsess, and they are obsessed about things, and they have certain rigid ways of dealing with, and they are perfectionistic. And people with OCD specifically don't see a problem with their symptoms. They are not actually upset and anxious about their symptoms. They just have problems with finishing tasks because of their preoccupation with perfectionism. But they actually tend to be people who are extremely rigid, controlling, critical. They have these lists, and they have to cope with those lists during the day, and they can come across as a harsh person, not necessarily the intention, but as a way of coping. So they find that they cope in a black and white kind of way in their lives, no gray areas. Whereas people with OCD are not necessarily perfectionistic, and they don't always struggle with that. They might have perfectionism as a trait there or as a part of it, and they might have similarities, but they definitely don't like their symptoms. Other related disorders are some autism spectrum disorders that might look similar, or even psychotic disorders. I can't go into all of those things, but they are not exactly the same. So, okay, we need to diagnose it based on whether there are obsessions and or compulsive behaviors, or both. So it's and the obsessions take a lot of time, and it really gets into the way of important activities in the people's lives. It develops sometimes at a young age, but let me first say all women and men of all races and ethnicities and backgrounds actually are affected by OCD. It's interesting. Usually it starts from any time from preschool to adulthood. If it usually occurs between 8 and 12 or the later teen years, early adulthood there, you would find that it is escalating. And it's about 1% of people, 1 in 100 adults that struggle with it, and 1 in 200 children that struggle with it. It's almost like similar to diabetes, but it is, uh, it is prevalent. So what you find with the causes of OCD is that so those are how it's found. Usually, I just want to say something. If you find with children that where it develops at a young age, usually there's also more of a brain-related disorder. But let's have a look at the causes of OCD. Okay, so there are medical causes, but it's still in research. It's still being researched, that whether the brain has a lot of a role to play or genetically. So the question is OCD a brain disorder or not? The research has suggestions that OCD involves problems in communication between the front part of the brain and the deeper structures, with problems with serotonin, but it's not necessarily the sole cause of OCD. Sometimes it's the chicken or the egg, which comes first. Has OCD created this problem, or has OCD been created by this brain problem? But usually with children in a younger age, like I said, they find that the brain picture looks different. You will find that people with OCD has a certain type of brain pattern, which is interesting, but there's still a lot of research going on there, and it is exciting to do research on the brain. But it does run in families, but it is not necessarily a single cause for the disorder. So we find that you will look at a certain part of genetics or family traits and biological things, but I think it's much better explained really by the psychological picture of it, and also treated through that. But and I'm not biased against the biological picture. I think it is good and it needs to be researched. But the genes does play a role, especially when it starts young in childhood. And then there are other things like Pandas disorder. It's a pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder that's associated with that streptococcal infection. So that's a very certain kind of thing that can develop as a reaction to infection where you have OCD symptoms. Or they're doing the research these days on the glutamate. It's another neural neurotransmitter like serotonin, but they're doing research on that, and new medications are being used in trial basis at the moment. Important when you look at medications like the usual depressants like the SSRIs, you need to give it over a longer period of time. Other causes, psychologically and personality factors. I mean, I think the temperament, the personality factors do play a role. If there's rigidity, there's a higher level of anxiety tendencies in the person, or if there's a lot of life stressors as well. I have found, and this was in the way that I was trained as well, in a systemic way, that if people are isolated systemically, if they are emotionally alone and they don't speak and talk to a lot of people about their feelings and thoughts, then their feelings and thoughts are not contained, and they don't really receive a lot of emotional support, and they don't receive feedback on their feelings and thoughts. So they just learn to fix their own anxieties on their own. It's like a dam that tries to fix its own water problem instead of receiving water and giving water and getting that flow. So it becomes a stale problem in there. So where therapy helps and counseling helps is that you're actually talking about it. Your thoughts are outside your mind. You're getting feedback on that, which brings relief and some perspective, and also some perspectives on the danger or the intensity of it, because it is outside your mind now. So you're less in isolation, which is very important. So that brings the social support in. But okay, so and stress in life. If you have a lot of stress, or you're very alone, you don't have a lot of support, or you're sitting with a lot of emotional uncertainty coupled with a rigid behavior or some tendency for anxiety, you might get into the place where you fall into some OCD patterns. Okay, so treatment, how do we treat OCD? I think if they would say the top line treatment is exposure and response prevention, ERP, and preferably with medication. So that's the ideal, is to say that's what the research shows, is ERP with medication. Now, in my own practice, I have found that I've dealt with clients without medication and with medication. Um, yeah, medication helps because it feeds that brain and it helps with the serotonin and it helps relieve some of the anxiety. And some of the SSRIs can actually relieve some of the obsessive thought patterns, which will help. It's like it takes you a few steps up um, the flight of stairs, so you don't have to start from the bottom. So it assists you, because therapy with OCD is not so easy, because it involves you facing fears, facing feelings, facing things that are really not so easy, your own scary feelings and thoughts. And it's also about acknowledging those things to yourself. It's hard, and even to somebody else, so it can even feel shameful. But in any case, let me explain. So you get CBT, that's cognitive behavioral therapy. That's the golden treatment with that has a component of exposure and response prevention. So what CBT is it means it's cognitive, your thinking and your behavior, your doing. So what it does is it looks at the effect of your thoughts on your feelings and your behavior, and how that triangle works, how your thoughts affect your feelings and your behavior, and how they all affect each other. And ERP comes in there as a way of exposing yourself to this thing that stresses you. Let's use the checking example. So now you've got the stove there, you've got this huge intrusive thought that accuses you, or that creates this fear that if you've left the stove off or on, the house is going to burn down, which is in the end going to mean you're a bad mother. That's where it ends up, and that comes from attachment problems and criticisms or whatever from your past. We can go into those things in later programs, but in the end, that's what your core belief is, you've got a fear of almost living out your core belief that I'm a failure. So I'm going to be a failure as a mother. So it just plays itself out in this rechecking and checking of the stove. So what you do with ERP is you actually go to the stove, you turn on the stove, um, and then you allow yourself to turn off the stove once, because that's reasonable. It's even reasonable to sometimes check another time. So what OCD does, our ERP does, is that we create a ladder of exposure. So we start with a very small exposure, something that is not so harsh. So we won't start with a stove there. We'll start with something very small, and then we'll work it up all the way to the exposing you to the thing that stresses you the most. So what happens is you expose yourself to that, you allow that anxiety. You have to learn to sit with the anxiety, or they call it tolerate the anxiety, until the anxiety fades away, and then you've prevented the response. So what in effect has happened is you've got this obsession. I must check things, otherwise something bad can happen, which in effect will mean I'm a bad mother or I'm a failure. So therefore I feel this intense anxiety, and I try and stop the anxiety by rechecking and checking. Even though the feedback from the stove is off, I still check and recheck until the anxiety is gone. So what you now do is you stop the compulsion, but that causes the anxiety to shoot up initially, flooding you. And that's in vivo exposure. That means you stand you're at the stove, it's in vivo, it's in your real life, and you're exposed, and the anxiety floods you. But then happens is you stop checking and rechecking. You could only check once because that's reasonable, and maybe a second time. But with treatment, what we'll do is we'll lower that, so you in the end only check once, and then you wait there until the anxiety has subsided. And that's ERP. And what happens is the compulsive behavior is now reduced in strength because you've not done it. So over time, it actually lessens, because the anxiety that it sends to say, you've not done this, it's going to happen, will be reduced, because what will happen is your brain will learn, well, no harm actually happened from me not doing the compulsion. Nothing bad happened. And it's as if the automatic alarm system in your brain that says, goodness, there's a crisis. It learns that, hey, there's no crisis, it's okay. And you learn to tolerate your anxiety, meaning you feel the anxiety, it floods you in a while, but after a while you get used to the anxiety, and it's as if the anxiety is not so threatening anymore. Now, this is a hard therapy for some people, so they've developed cognitive therapy just for OCD, or acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a different kind of therapy that looks at, let me just first look at cognitive therapy. Cognitive therapy then addresses the thought patterns that goes into your mind. So what it addresses is there are two kinds. They talk about unhelpful thinking styles and your core beliefs, your deeper level thinking. So what they want to do is they want you to become more aware of the kinds of thoughts that you think. They work with your beliefs, the things that you believe. If you've got perfectionistic thoughts, they would work with helping you to change and challenge those perfectionistic thinking through various techniques to help you to think about your perfectionistic thinking. For example, if you've got a fear of checking and rechecking, we will use what we call Socratic, that's Socrates, his way of questioning you, to talk to you about that kind of fear, and how realistic it is, and is there evidence for it. Do you if you have to ask somebody else, if you have to talk to them about their fear of checking the stove, what would you advise them? You work through that, but then sometimes people don't get a lot of relief. So what you then actually have to do is work with the core beliefs, the deeper seated beliefs, that are beliefs that are seated in their person, that says that, like I said earlier, I'm a failure. Now you've got ways of actually detecting the core beliefs. Or I cannot do this. I'm helpless. And those things usually come from experiences earlier on in life, where you've actually internalized things, and you've deduced, you've made conclusions about life and how people treated you. Or it's not all to blame on your parents, but they do have a role. So there's lots of those from schema therapy. There's lots of other schema that you've developed earlier on in life. But be as it may, you now sitting with the core beliefs, and then we will look at the core beliefs, and you work through questioning and experiences, and maybe even putting some things to the test. Um, that kind of therapy takes longer. It's also effective, but the most effective, quickest ways is exposure and response prevention. I've seen it in my practice. It has worked incredibly well for a lot of people with with fears that you would think, wow, um, you can do it with a fear of heights as well. So there's also a similarity to treating phobias here, where you actually expose yourself to the thing that you're afraid of. The anxiety comes, you learn to tolerate it. Acceptance and commitment therapy looks at it a little bit different. It does not, it's almost like getting to a place of just meditating to a degree, because what you're doing is you're also exposing yourself to what is bothering you. You're allowing the anxiety, you're not judging it as good or bad. Um, so it's like mindfulness in a sense, and you are allowing yourself to just become aware of it. You're aware of this anxiety. You, in a sense, unhook yourself from the thought that hooks you into this compulsion, and you actually decide to rather follow your values and more productive thinking, and looking at how you'd like to play that out. So in a sense, what you're doing is, your anxiety is not, you're not just tolerating the anxiety, you're actually reframing your whole relationship with anxiety. So this is now purely clinical. Um, some ACT or ACT um, clinicians feel that it's a bit better than exposure and response prevention, or you combine it. You need to have exposure and response prevention training and CBT to really effectively. That's what some clinicians say. Use ACT, but I think what it does is it gives you a less of a judgmental perspective on, oh, these things, and anxiety is not so bad. Anxiety is not so frightening. Anxiety actually plays a role in your life that is very healthy. Anxiety is, we actually feel anxious about things that we care for and we care about. And we sometimes feel anxious when things are really important for us. And we don't want to mess up this interview or that. So I felt anxious before talking tonight to you guys. So I had that anxiety, and I had to just sit with my anxiety, acknowledge it. And what I then do is I take it to the Lord. I use prayer. as a way to anchor it in the values that I have. So it's almost like ACT therapy there, and I anchor it in the word. But what does the word say? Because it's truth, it doesn't change. And it gives me certainty in that regard. And I've learned to hear the voice of the Lord, so it then changes them. So I've given you some inputs on how you treat it from a psychological perspective, and obviously you then work with the family as well. You support them, empower them to deal with this, because families actually can enable a lot of OCD. They would rather than go to the shop and buy you 20 hand washing liquids, and these days they have to buy you sanitizers. It's a have to from the government, so they can sanitize, and you also have to sanitize, but they sanitize 67 times more than is needed. But I'm not joking with it, but sometimes families enable it in that way, or they adjust their schedules in such a way that they actually drive you around because you don't want to do this or you don't want to do that. So it becomes difficult. What actually needs to happen is that families need to realize how they are participating in this behavior and start to make changes, to rather assist the person to say, look, we need to deal with this, and this is how it affects us, and we care about you and we really want to help you, but this needs to professional help. And because trying to solve some things that professionals can do much easier, it's just easier. I don't service the complicated car. I service the easy car. So we do the easy things ourselves, but sometimes we just need help, and it's okay. So what some families do is they take on extra responsibilities. They actually do more things for the other person because that person just doesn't want to do this and cannot do that, and so they run after the person, and that can also become manipulative even, and the other person can actually withdraw from life as OCD takes over. So it is a difficult one there. There's lots of wisdom needed. Um, can't go into it too much now, but I'll spend some time on a later program as well with this. But it's important to help your family member find that right treatment. So you need to work with that. So you can bring some books or programs into it. Send them this program, just so they can hear that there is definite hope. You can encourage them, not judge them, but just encourage and just share with them how you're feeling and that you're concerned. And I want to just add that OCD is a very frightening disorder, and for the person subjectively, it feels extremely invasive and extremely limiting to their lives. So what happens is people who struggle with this often find that they are so afraid, and they don't really feel hope. So it's difficult when you're struggling with OCD. I do want to assure you that researchers have done a lot of work, and ERP and CBT and ACT really work. It works, and medication works. So there is hope out there. There is really. So you do need a trained therapist, a psychologist that is trained with this. Otherwise, they can screw up. But there's a lot of help that can be offered. I've seen a number of persons who struggle with OCD, and it's given them mental torment. Even my own struggles with OCD. What I've struggled with mentally was the religious one. I would feel extreme guilt for certain intrusive thoughts. Sometimes it was an aggressive kind of thought, or sexual-based thought, and it would go against what I know the Lord doesn't want, and then I would go into this extreme guilt, or even now confessing my sin, but then I don't feel the relief, or I just feel this intense guilt. And that also related to deeper beliefs that I'm not good enough. That related to deeper schemas of abandonment, rejection. So I needed to deal with those things, and with the lies if I'm not good enough, and with the fact that I've sinned, and that meaning I'm a sinner and I do need forgiveness, and what forgiveness actually meant. So as soon as I really started to understand that and started to understand grace, I got to a new place of actually the threat, the intrusive thoughts lost the strength, the accusations that lost their strength. I could actually start to that changed the way I viewed my intrusive thoughts. So that changed the beliefs, and then so I'll share a bit more as to what happened with me. From a Christian point of view, I'm just going to end off with this, and there's a lot to say, so I won't be able to cover everything, but I'll definitely spend more time on other programs. We look at that you're a body, soul, and spirit. So you've got a body, and your body is tied to the world, and it is a world that is caught up in sin, and you can see the cycle of death on earth. We don't see a cycle of eternal life on earth. So we see death is here, and that is due to sin, the curse on sin that God cursed the earth with as a result. And that's what Christ did, is to take that sin and the judgment for sin on himself and the death to give us life. But when you're dealing with this battle and with OCD, you would know that you are a broken person, or you're not whole yet. So your brain and your mind is broken, and you're subject to a lot of things, and you're actually open to a lot. Like, you can experience cold and warmth. I mean, go and sit in the African sun for 3 hours without putting on suntan lotion. I'm sure you're going to change your color. I changed to red. So it's exposure to the environment. So we're exposed to the spiritual forces in the air, the dark forces that we know work with our minds as well through lies. Jesus said that the devil is the author and the father of lies. And we also know that there's a lot of dilemmas with the world around us, with accusations against Christians or people, or you yourself. You've got people who've hurt you, a relationship that's from your past that's gone wrong. You were not raised in the perfect home, and you have a personality style and all those things that are subject to sinfulness as well, that you do certain things. So a lot of stuff. So even your brain is not perfect, and it is, and in our hearts we also tend, if we've not met Christ, we are sinners, meaning we don't serve God, we don't look for Him, we cannot actually please Him fully. So then we're stuck. And once we receive Christ and His forgiveness, we also have a battle with sin. So it's meaning that from a Christian perspective, your battle is still there. But if you're a Christian, you also your root intervention lies with how you are treating your thinking. So what happens is when you have obsessions, that actually the obsessive nature of your obsessions, when you start to work with your biblical thinking and with changing the way you think, it actually addresses a lot of the obsessions. Because the difference between what the Bible offers and what postmodernism offers is that the Bible offers certainty through faith, but postmodernism tries to say there's no certainty, there's no truth. You need to just deal with the fact that there's no certainty. Whereas the need for certainty is also a common thing for people. So that's why we look for insurance. We insure this, insure that. We go and study so that we are sure that we're going to have a job, or that we can look after our families. We drink our vitamins so that we are sure that we won't get ill, or we go and exercise so that we don't get a heart attack. We need certainty. We need to do things proactively, and that's not bad. But a little bit of uncertainty, and you never know when you're going to die. We know everybody dies. That that is a part of life, and we know that we don't have full assurance. So it is normal to also live with a certain level of uncertainty. But when you're a Christian, or when you've got OCD, you're actually looking for a whole lot more certainty, and maybe not on every area. For me, it was financially. It was as if financial uncertainty meant I'm a failure. Again, it confirmed that core belief, and then it looked as if something really bad was going to happen. So I was looking for a lot of financial certainty, and it was as if financial certainty I felt would make me feel safe. Um, Whereas that was then sinful in nature, because I was not trusting in God. So it's a problem of trust. And I would really work up myself. My obsession was to get this safety, and I would have these intrusive thoughts, and then I would have this situation where there's not a lot of financial security, and then I would go into compulsions to try and sort out this, and that's not bad to take action. It's actually taking action on your finances is a good thing. Taking a well thought about action, but and to really do something to reduce your expenses, increase your income. All those things are good, but it becomes obsessive so I would like draw up budgets and then try to just create something to make me feel better and to cut expenses here and there that sometimes became irrational, became too much. And I would just have this sense of anxiety and worry that almost that goes into an excessive worry. And I would try to relieve that through other compulsions in my mind. I had to deal with that in a biblical way to say, but what am I trusting in? What is my idol? Do I trust in the Lord? Do I trust in myself? Because saying that I have to be certain about this actually ignores the fact that the Lord said, but I will look after you, I'm with you. So it really took some work for me to acknowledge that feeling, those feelings and those thoughts of anxiety and fear that I'm not going to be okay, that it is all going to crash in my face. And I had to actually realize that I'm becoming self-obsessed about reducing or controlling my anxiety and my worry. It was more about me. And then it actually reduced my ability to look out and to serve the Lord and love others. It reduced that because I was just busy with my own anxiety and trying to fix it. And I would then become frustrated with my wife if she spends money on this and this and that. Instead of going to the Lord, talking to him about my fears, my worries, getting truth from him, looking at the truth, making it a part of my life, subjecting myself to it, and then as the fear arises, acknowledging the fear, acknowledging my anxieties, acknowledging my own limitations, even my situation, and then turning that to the Lord in a way of prayer and reminding myself of the truth of what the word says, and how the Lord will provide for me. And what then happened is the Lord actually provided because he's faithful. So I got more and more evidence in my life of how the Lord provided. Now, initially, I would ignore the evidence and just continue with the worry cycle and the obsession. But later I realized that was also sinful because of my own fears was getting a higher degree of attention than the Lord's word. So I would go to the Lord and confess that and just acknowledge that with him and tell him about my fears, be real about it, acknowledge it. I'm not going to suppress it or run away from it or judge myself about it. I'm just going to be honest with the Lord and honest about the sinful nature of it, meaning that I'm missing God's plan here. But I'm also honest about my own fears and my own struggles and my own weaknesses, knowing that he loves me and he wants the best for me, and that I can trust his motive and I can trust his character. Scripture that helped me a lot was that the Lord is light and in him there is no darkness at all. And he's light, he's good, he is love, and he loves me, and he showed his love to me at the cross. So what then happened is that I would take myself to that, and I would pray about it, and I would ask the Lord to give me word as well, and he would send his truth on my way, and that becomes a light for my path, meaning I can hold on to the truth. In the end, as I was dealing with this and acknowledging my fears to the Lord, getting his word, then I would acknowledge my fears, let the feeling be there, but I would hold on to the word. So it's like acceptance and commitment therapy. I would accept this feeling, but I would commit myself to what the Lord said and move towards that and hook to that, although the feelings are here. So the feelings were there and the situation was there, the sensory things, the things in this world were there, and they would elicit feelings, but I would commit to what the Lord said and let that guide my behavior, and then move on to continue with my life, even though I feel these things. And that's actually exposing myself to the anxiety, acknowledging it, but not allowing me to go into a compulsive behavior of now going into trying to solve this. And then I would go and try to do reasonable financial things. But as I saw the Lord provide, that also provided evidence for me to remind myself, look, can you see this? The Lord is providing. It just confirmed the validity of the truth. So that helped me. So I'll go into more detail with that as well next time, as to doubt and all the other things, what the Bible says about the certainty and your overactive sense of responsibility. I'll go into all those things in the Christian view on that. So in the end, just to sum up what I've said today, OCD is a very real experience. and it's hard for people. I mean, all of us have little traits of it or elements of it, and it doesn't mean you're a failure or a loser or you're a weak person. That's just something you're struggling with. We all struggle with something, and many of us have lots of struggles, and it's okay. And it's about acknowledging the things that we are obsessed about, that we maybe give too much of an emphasis on in our lives, and working with the things we believe about ourselves, about the Lord. And we've got these frightening thoughts, and coming to grips with or acknowledging those thoughts and our own feelings. What also helped me is just to realize this is just my feeling. It's just a feeling. Feelings are like waves. They come and go. It's okay. I can feel stuff. It won't affect me or the world around me, really. It's just feelings, and I can learn to tolerate it. And life will have a lot of feelings still and events, and I can deal with it moment by moment, even though I don't have certainty. That's where the truth comes in. I have the Lord. And then it's about the compulsion, realizing that I do compulsive things. Sometimes we do compulsive things to try and make it better. Some people even drink or eat or do stuff to just feel that sense of relief, that emotional eating. But what we do is, once we start to acknowledge our feelings, the reason for our feelings, and resist that compulsion, it actually comes down, and we can hold on to the truth of the Lord's word. I am going to continue next time with, it will be in the next month that I will release another program on OCD, and especially the biblical view of it, Christian psychology view. God bless you. Please send me your questions as well, so that I'll do question and answer videos. So you're welcome to send questions to Matters of the Soul on Facebook. You'll also see at mattersofthesoul.org is the website. There you will find email addresses as well. Erich, ERICH, at mattersofthesoul.org. You can also send to Monique at mattersofthesoul.org. Send your questions, and we'll see if I can answer them or do a program about them. Great stuff. All of the best. Until next time. Cheers.